2 hours ago, the White House signed a directive that crossed a line no government has ever crossed against an allied nation in the digital age. Not a tariff, not a sanctions package. A federal order instructing American internet infrastructure operators to sever routing agreements with Canadian networks, cutting Canada off from the American-controlled backbone that carries a significant share of its international data traffic. The directive invokes the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to classify Canadian telecommunications companies as entities subject to emergency network restrictions. The named targets: TELUS, Bell Canada, Rogers Communications. 3 companies that collectively manage the network infrastructure of an entire G7 nation. Washington's calculation was straightforward. Major Canadian data flows, financial transactions, cloud services, content delivery, route through American network exchange points. Cut the routing agreements and Canada's digital economy faces immediate disruption. Bay Street trading systems, Canadian government communications, cloud infrastructure serving Canadian businesses, all of it suddenly slower, partially dark. The pressure, Washington believed, would be impossible to sustain politically. The directive has 3 components. First, all American Tier 1 Internet providers, AT&T, Verizon, Lumen Technologies, are instructed to terminate BGP peering agreements with Canadian carriers within 72 hours. BGP, Border Gateway Protocol, is the routing system directing Internet traffic across networks. Terminate the peering agreements and Canadian traffic can no longer use direct routes through American infrastructure. Canadian networks do not go dark. They become slower, more expensive to operate, and significantly degraded. Second, American content delivery networks are instructed to deprioritize Canadian origin traffic under emergency management provisions. For Canadian businesses relying on American CDN infrastructure, this creates immediate performance degradation, invisible to regulators but instantly visible to users. Third, the directive instructs the FCC to open emergency review proceedings on all active submarine cable landing licenses held by Canadian operators. The cables keep functioning. The investment backing them begins to unravel. Washington had a name for this strategy inside planning documents: dark pressure. Network degradation is technically complex and politically opaque. Canadian citizens would experience slower internet and rising costs without a clear, attributable villain. The pressure would be diffuse, deniable, and cumulative. What Washington had not modeled was that Carney had spent 14 months studying exactly this scenario, and that the Canadian response would make dark pressure the most self-defeating strategy the White House had yet deployed. 47 minutes after the directive was made public, Carney appeared at a podium in Ottawa, flanked by 2 people Washington had not anticipated: the CEO of Carney, Canada's National Research and Education Network, and the Director General of the Communications Security Establishment, a Prime Minister standing with the people who actually run Canada's internet infrastructure. The visual required no explanation. He opened with a single technical fact, delivered with the precision of someone who had prepared it for months. Approximately 30% of American internet traffic transiting between the United States and Europe passes through Canadian fiber infrastructure. That traffic does not ask for permission. It flows where the routing tables send it. As of midnight tonight, Canada is updating its routing tables. Then he announced 4 countermeasures, each targeting a pressure point dark pressure had not modeled. The first, Canada is immediately rerouting all Canadian-managed transatlantic data flows away from American network exchange points. Canadian fiber infrastructure, particularly routes through the maritime provinces connecting to European submarine cables, carries a substantial volume of American data traffic bound for Europe. Rerouting it adds latency. It adds cost. It applies exactly the diffuse, cumulative pressure dark pressure was designed to impose on Canada, applied in reverse. The second countermeasure was the one that made American cloud infrastructure executives reach for their phones. Canada is invoking regulatory authority over submarine cable landing stations on Canadian soil to implement emergency traffic inspection protocols on all flows connecting to American CDN and cloud operators. The protocols do not block traffic. They slow it, by exactly enough to make latency visible in performance metrics. Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud all operate infrastructure depending on low-latency Canadian routing. Every added millisecond is a breach of service-level agreements worth billions in contractual exposure. We did not build this capability to use it. We built it to demonstrate that the capability exists. Washington now knows it exists. The third countermeasure targeted the one thing dark pressure was designed to obscure: attribution. Canada is publishing a public real-time technical dashboard showing every instance of American-directed network degradation, the specific routes affected, the specific operators implementing restrictions, the specific timestamps. Every Canadian business experiencing degraded service can see exactly which American operator implemented the restriction and under which provision. The deniability is removed. The opacity dark pressure depended on is gone. The fourth countermeasure silenced the room. Canada is activating bilateral digital infrastructure agreements with the United Kingdom, Germany, and France. Pre-negotiated frameworks providing Canadian carriers with alternative routing through European network exchange points, bypassing American infrastructure entirely for a significant share of Canadian international traffic. The agreements had been signed 8 months earlier. The technical configurations had been tested. The routing tables were ready to update. Canada had built a parallel internet path before Washington tried to close the original one. Carney closed with a message directed at the American technology industry. The internet was built on the principle that routing finds a way around damage. Canada is not damaged. Canada is rerouting. The question Washington should be asking is not what happens to Canadian internet. The question is what happens to American infrastructure when the country that hosts 30% of its transatlantic routing decides to be less accommodating. The American technology sector's reaction was faster than any previous industry response in this confrontation. Amazon, Microsoft, and Google all contacted the White House within the hour, not through government relations teams, through their chief technology officers. A senior executive at a major cloud provider told financial media that Canadian routing changes would trigger automatic SLA breach notifications across thousands of enterprise contracts within 24 hours of implementation. The Internet Association described the directive as a fundamental misunderstanding of how Internet infrastructure operates and a direct threat to American technology companies' ability to serve their global customers. The Telecommunications Industry Association warned that terminating BGP peering with Canadian carriers would create routing instability affecting American networks as well, because Internet routing is not a one-way system. Disrupting Canadian routing disrupts American routing at every intersection point. Republican senators from Virginia, Texas, Oregon, and Iowa demanded emergency briefings. The FCC's own technical staff circulated an internal assessment concluding the directive's implementation would create instability extending well beyond Canadian origin traffic. These were not opposition voices. These were the institutional custodians of American telecommunications infrastructure telling their own government what it had just done. The international response arrived through technical channels before diplomatic ones. The European Internet Exchange Points, DSI Frankfurt, AMS9 Amsterdam, Lynx London, issued technical notices confirming their infrastructure was prepared to handle the traffic shift. The alternative path existed. It was operational. It had been tested. NATO's Communications Directorate expressed concern about Allied digital infrastructure stability. The European Commission described the directive as a dangerous precedent for using routing as a coercion instrument. The structural reality no executive order can route around. The Internet was designed by engineers who assumed any node might become unreliable and built protocols that automatically find alternative paths. Canada has sufficient fiber connectivity. Canada now has the international routing agreements. The alternative path is active. And routing is bidirectional. The latency added to Canadian traffic is shared equally with every American company using the same infrastructure. The degradation Washington designed for Canada is applied symmetrically. Trump has 3 paths. Maintain the directive and watch American cloud providers absorb SLA breach exposure while European exchange points permanently absorb Canadian traffic. Once routing relationships are established, they persist. Rescind the directive. But Canada's bilateral digital agreements with the UK, Germany, and France are already active, and Canadian carriers who spent 8 months building alternative infrastructure will not dismantle it because Washington reversed course. Escalate, and discover that every move in the digital domain is visible, attributable, and reversible by Canada in ways that impose symmetrical costs on American infrastructure. 2 hours ago, the White House thought it had found the invisible lever. Digital pressure that would be felt but not seen, cumulative but not attributable, effective but deniable. What it found instead was a prime minister who understood BGP routing tables, had pre-negotiated the alternative paths, and had built the dashboard that made the invisible visible to every Canadian business and every American technology executive simultaneously. Washington wanted dark. Carney turned the lights on.